Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, at least 8 people are killed in the worst winter storm South Africa's Southern Cape's experienced in 30 years. Thousands are left homeless, and those living in Cape Town's shanty towns have been worst affected. Also, France calls on the UN Security Council to back a West African force aimed at tackling terrorism and trafficking across the Sahel. Paris proposes a draft resolution that's in support of Niger, Mali, Chad, Burkina Faso and Mauritania's plans to set up a joint force. And in DR Congo, a former police chief long seen as the prime suspect in the murder of a prominent rights activist in 2010 has been made a national hero. General John Numbi is one of 8 senior officers recently honoured by President Joseph Kabila. But first, at least 8 people have been killed in the worst winter storm South Africa's Southern Cape's experienced in 3 decades. Thousands of people have been left homeless. Authorities in Cape Town say that they tried to take early measures to safeguard poorer residents living in makeshift homes. Those living in the city's many shanty towns have been the worst affected by the strong winds and heavy rains. 3 people also died in bushfires east of Cape Town, caused by high winds fanning blazes. Now, the storm ended the province's worst drought in more than a century. Tim Butcher's in Cape Town and tells us more about efforts to safeguard shantytown communities.
It's fair to say that not enough was done because so many suffered, but the reality is that shanty towns are exactly that. Shanty towns, temporary accommodation, no storm drainage, no sewage, no access roads for emergency vehicles. That's the nature of them, sadly. So when a disaster like this happens, it is very focused in that area. But that's the reality of Cape Town and modern South Africa is a vast number of people living in these communities. Many of your viewers will remember Soweto from the 1970s and 1980s. That's up in Johannesburg, the largest township then. Now that has been overtaken by one here in Cape Town called Khayelitsha. And the poor residents of Khayelitsha have lost homes today, had their roofs ripped off, had their lives totally destroyed and shaken up. But the reality is we've had a storm today. A month ago, it was fire because there was drought. So if it's not one thing, it's the other. The reality is that the economic infrastructure here isn't as robust as it should be to be able to cope with the population.
So, Tim, the region was also struggling with the drought prior to the heavy rains that dropped in on Tuesday. Is there perhaps, to some extent, a bit of a silver lining to the downpour, despite the damage and the death?
Well, it is an extreme, as you mentioned in your intro, at the very same time that rain is falling, there's a fire, and 77,000 people in the town in the area east of Cape Town you referred to, a place called Nisa, they have been evacuated tonight. Sure, there is a silver lining to these clouds. Our metaphors a bit mixed up when we're talking about weather and silver clouds and silver linings. But the reality is that one storm is not going to be enough to ease the water shortage in the Cape area. And one estimate was that they need 16 deluges, like over the last 24 hours, in order for the reservoirs to refill. So the place, this region is fraught. It has a sort of infrastructure fragility. If it's one thing, it's either too hot or it's too stormy. And the point is that the government, the institutions here don't build up that sort of stock to be able to deal with it, whether it's capacity for dealing with rain or shortage of rainwater, or in this case, a surplus when it comes in a surge. But it's a modern reality of the El Niño world we live in, where weather patterns are extreme, and I'm afraid Cape Town has taken a pummeling these last 24 hours.
Tim Butcher there for us in Cape Town. Now, France has called on the UN Security Council to back a West African force aimed at tackling terrorism and trafficking across the Sahel. Paris has circulated a draft resolution in support of Niger, Mali, Chad, Burkina Faso and Mauritania's plans to set up a joint force authorised to use all means necessary to restore peace and security. Our UN correspondent tells us more.
This French-drafted resolution is all about tackling terrorism in that vast Sahel region. The French ambassador to the United Nations, François Delattre, said that we cannot afford to let the Sahel region become a safe haven for terrorists from across the world. So the focus will be on combating terrorism. This African Union force will be given a UN mandate under Chapter 7. That means that it can use all necessary measures to protect civilians and to combat terrorism, people trafficking and the trafficking of drugs, because of course those are the main ways in which terrorists in that area finance their operations. It seems that it does have broad political backing, this resolution, and it's likely to come to a vote sometime next week. It is likely to pass, but there are some issues regarding the financing of it. The EU's already pledged 50 million euros to this G5 force, yet some countries, it would seem, are opposed to assessed contributions, so that could be an issue. And another issue could be how to structure the chain of command, because soldiers and personnel from 5 different countries will be taking part in this force. It will be in place in order to support the already existing UN mission, peacekeeping mission in Mali, which is the most murderous UN peacekeeping mission in existence. More than 100 Blue helmets have been killed over the 4 years that it's been in place. This new force will also bolster up the French Opération Barkhane, which functions across that vast Sahel region combating terrorism. This UN mission in Mali is really the only which focuses very much on terrorism. So in some ways it is a little new. It's pushing boundaries of UN peacekeeping. You also have to put this in the context of a time when the United States in particular is looking at ways to cut funding to peacekeeping across the world, and at a time when the United Nations is looking in particular in Africa at ways to delegate peacekeeping responsibility over more to the African Union.
Jessica Lemizuri there for us in New York. Well, in DR Congo, a former police chief, long seen as being the prime suspect in the murder of a prominent rights activist in 2010, has been made a national hero. General John Numbi is one of 8 senior officers recently honoured by President Joseph Kabila in a move that's been strongly criticised from some quarters. Nicolas Chamin tells us more.
Joseph Kabila's decision has enraged human rights activists in Congo. He has made former police chief John Numbi a national hero. Yet many NGOs consider Numbi to be the key suspect in the murder of activist Floribert Chebeya. In June 2010, the founder of the NGO Voice of the Voiceless was found dead in his car near Kinshasa. The day before, he'd been summoned to police headquarters by Numbi. The current head of the NGO said he's shocked.
It's incomprehensible. How can someone, whatever their rank, who is suspected of being involved in the murder of a human rights activist, be made national hero? Such a thing can only happen in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
The government spokesman told France 24 Numbi has never been charged, and therefore there is no reason not to honour him. Numbi has only appeared in court as a witness in 2011. This is what he said back then.
He never called me, not that day, not the day before, not the week before, not the month before. Mr. Chebeya never called me, never sent me a text. That day it was impossible for me to organize a meeting with him.
So far in this case, only 1 policeman has been sentenced to 15 years in prison. In September 2016, Washington placed Numbi on a blacklist of undesirable people, describing him as an influential advisor to President Kabila.
Now, the oldest known fossil of the Homo sapiens species has been discovered in Morocco. The remains date back more than 300,000 years, pushing back the story of humanity by at least 100 millennia. Sharon Gaffney has more.
Replicas of fossils unearthed at an archaeological site at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, a discovery that could rewrite the history of our species. Scientists say the specimens indicate that the first humans evolved across various parts of Africa, 100,000 years earlier than previously thought.
We don't claim that the cradle of modern humankind is in North Africa. Instead, we support the view that the whole African continent probably was involved in the emergence of our species. naturally, if we move beyond 300,000, further back in the past, possibly there is a point of emergence of the very first Homo sapiens. But at the time when the Jebel Irhoud people lived 300,000 years ago, our species already dispersed all over Africa.
Professor Hublin has identified the fossils as early Homo sapiens. He says they have a combination of modern and primitive features.
In the Jebel Irhoud humans, we have part of the anatomy that is already very close to what we see in living humans, but other parts that are still have still to undergo a long evolutionary process, especially the brain. So it's a brain which is much less globular, it's more elongated.
The findings were outlined in 2 papers published in the journal Nature.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.